So you read like crazy.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, yes. Welcome to Behind the Pages. Bessel Van Der Kolk is with us today to talk about The Body Keeps Score. Bessel is a world-renowned psychiatrist who specializes in the field of treating victims of trauma. He lectures around the world about his topic. He is also the director and the founder of the Trauma Center in Boston. The Body Keeps Score is a book about his work in this field, starting from his early days in his career, when not that much was known about the treatment, the best treatments for the victims of trauma. And the book works its way up to the present day where more is known, and I'm sure more will need to be known.
Hi.
Welcome to the show, first of all. First of all, there are very disturbing numbers regarding how many people are affected by trauma in their life. Can you, first of all, define trauma and then tell us just a few statistics about it?
Yeah, I think trauma is an experience that simply overwhelms your coping mechanisms, so you sort of are not the same again, because you sort of get reset to see yourself as helpless and the world is a dangerous place. It's not so much the event that's a trauma, it's an experience that you experience as such. For example, the events of 9/11, for many people did not become a trauma because things could be done. And people could run, and people could intervene, and people could do things. So trauma has a lot to do with helplessness, with immobilization, being held down, not being able to use your stress hormones to fight back, and then the stress hormones get turned against you, and then you start feeling panicky and upset all the time. So it's something that sort of redefines your life, and the treatment of trauma is about helping it to make it just a bad experience that happened a long time ago.
Right, and isn't still happening now.
Right.
So the numbers that you talked about are like 1 in 5 Americans have been molested at some point in their life. I mean,
the numbers are stunning. And
yeah.
Like towards the end of my book, I discovered that more kids get shot than die of leukemia, let's say. And I don't see any billboards around Boston saying, give money to kids who live in violence. The numbers, like there's 2.5 million kids whose parents are in jail. More women have been killed by their husbands or boyfriends, partners, than soldiers have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. It goes on and on and on. Just, I would say that, and that's really one of the major points of the book, is that much of human misery is caused by trauma, trauma of child abuse, of neglect, of domestic violence. Somebody asked me the other day, why do we study trauma? Is there more trauma today? And I say, no, there's less trauma that allows us to actually see that it's not necessarily a condition of life. Like, I doubt whether there's many people in Iraq or Afghanistan who do not suffer from PTSD. And that's part of the reason why it sort of keeps going on and on.
Yeah.
And the countries where people know most about trauma are Norway, Australia, Holland. There's places where violence rates are extremely low, and then you can start paying attention. Oh, this is unusual.
Yes.
But as long as there's a lot of violence going on, you come to sort of see it as part of everyday life.
So when people experience trauma, they move on, but it really leaves its mark, doesn't it?
They move on, but actually Sigmund Freud, who is much maligned these days, wrote a spectacular paper in 1893 about it. He says it becomes like a foreign body. It becomes like a splinter that sits in your mind and erupts from time to time and sort of intrudes itself into your life. And the trauma doesn't come back as a memory, but as a reaction. Suddenly you feel enraged, suddenly you feel totally out of proportion frightened. And that emotional brain where the trauma sits, the back of your brain that has nothing to do with reason, sort of pops out, and there you go again. You take leave of your senses, you lose it, you become panicked, upset, enraged, stuff like that.
And a lot of these people then who don't have help turn to drugs.
Yeah, so it's this issue of people talk about resiliency. Everybody tries to cope with this. And so some people cope with it by working all the time. Workaholism is a very good thing. You isolate yourself from people, you work all the time, and so you stay in your cubicle and nobody gets the better of you. Or you take drugs, or you play computer games, or you take razor blades and start cutting yourself, or you do something to sort of desperately try to stay in control over that body that keeps sort of running away with you. I say the vast majority of drug abuse is associated with earlier trauma. It's very rare to see somebody who becomes a drug addict who not also has a history of abuse and neglect.
Survivors of trauma usually experience some kind of reactivation when they're exposed to just even the smallest amount of danger.
Right.
How does this, what's happening in their brain when this happens?
Well, see, we have, roughly speaking, you can say we have 2 brains or 3 brains, but we have these layers of our brain. And the best thing to look at is little babies. Little babies become very aroused and very upset by minor things. And you get to your frontal lobe, and your frontal lobe sort of helps to organize it. And how well you're organized depends on the balance between your, what I call the emotional brain that we share with all animals, mammals, and your rational brain. And so when life sort of goes along predictably and quietly, you're in control, you feel in control, and then when something comes out there that says you're in danger or this person is messing with you, that part of your brain may take over, you secrete all kinds of stress hormones, and then you blow up and do things that afterwards may make you feel ashamed or scared of yourself, or may turn people against you or hurt other people. But it's not a part of you, it's not a slice of you, and it's an unowned part by and large.
Early in your career, you talked about when you first started working with victims of trauma, people, soldiers at the VA hospital who were recently had fought in Vietnam, and you talked about one of your earlier clients, I think his name was Tom, who was suffering from PTSD before that was even a defined diagnosis. Can you tell us a little bit about him? How did that play out in him?
Well, see, the reason why he was sort of the opening of my career is that he was a typical, it's not recent, this is 10 years after the end of the war. And that's what frightens me so much about what's going on right now.
Right, because
is
of
that
how long,
the stuff didn't really hit the fan till 10 years after the war. So when people are talking right now about Iraq and Afghani veterans, my sense is like, you haven't seen nothing yet. Because there's this lingering time that people think they go to manage it, they start drinking, so quietly try to manage. At some point they just can't manage it anymore. And so Tom was one of those guys. And what really opened up everything about me was that he was having nightmares. I had studied nightmares in earlier little slice of my career. It was the one thing I recognized, so I treated him for his nightmares. And then he didn't want to take my nightmare pills. And I asked him why. He said, if my nightmares go away, my friends will have died in vain, and I need to live my life as a living memorial to my friends who died in Vietnam. And that statement just blew my socks off. And I thought, so because I've always been interested in biology, I would sort of consider myself a neuroscientist now, but it really made me realize this is not simply about memory, it's not simply about fear circuits, it's a whole complex of systems, and how much it has to do with relationships. And it's sort of confirmed, and I've seen it more and more as time goes on, is that our brains are interpersonal organs. We're here to communicate with each other, to get along together. That's really what we have brains for, and that mental illness or mental troubles always play themselves out in relationships. And that most traumas, people talk about trauma as a rape and assault event, but it's almost always has something to do with an interpersonal relationship. And the worst traumas are traumas that are inflicted on you by your intimate partners, by your own parents, your own caregivers, own bosses, where you're in a relationship, you try to maintain the relationship, and oftentimes people who you're very dependent on, like as a kid or as a spouse, start becoming sources of danger and fear, and then you set up this horrible conflict inside of you between loyalty and love, which can continue to persist, and these stress hormones that keep going like, I'm in danger, I need to run.
Right. But, you know, it's true. What you see in how this kind of plays out in people is that I think, at least from what I understood from what you said in your book, is that when people are subjected to trauma from somebody in a position of power over them, and especially prolonged periods of power, for instance, an abusive parent, an abusive spouse, where there isn't really an escape route.
Right.
That is particularly damaging.
Yeah. So inescapable shock is the model.
Now that's based. That term I think is based on research that was done on
with dogs. Right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that research done by Marty Seligman, who later on became the big champion of positive psychology. So after starting to seeing all these helpless animals, he said, I better do something more cheerful with my life. And so that's what he did. And indeed, that also makes sense, is that what he's working on, and I'm much sympathy with that, is our job now is to help people to once again positively engage with their lives and find something that they can become devoted to. And the big question is, how can you help people to once again really deeply commit themselves to other human beings, to, let's say, if you're a traumatized woman and you have a kid who is colicky and difficult, it's very likely that the kid becomes a trigger for you to become upset. And so taking care of your kid may become a very burdensome experience for you, because your body keeps reacting like you're in danger, and you may become more upset than your kid becomes. And so then the treatment becomes, how can we help this mom to quiet down enough so you can see this kid as a separate human being who needs certain care, but how do we help these parents to modulate and moderate themselves? And so the issue of interpersonal triggers becomes very important.
Can you talk a little bit about the difficulties that victims of trauma experience when they talk about their trauma?
Well, the problem is that talking about it brings it back. So for most people, when something terrible happens to you, you ask, as a friend, tell me what happened. They say, I don't want to talk about it. Because talking about it brings it all back, and the stress hormones start showing up. I have a whole bunch of videotapes I like to show about it, is that the moment says, tell me about your trauma, you see a person becoming agitated as they bring the experience to mind. At that point, different parts of the brain start going offline, and you become too hyper-aroused.
And you can see this in actual
you can see those in brain
functional
scans,
MRIs.
And on quantitative EEGs, a number of different ways you can do that. And then the parts of the brain that would help you to say, oh, this is a very unpleasant thing that happened a long time ago, start going offline, and it starts feeling as if it's happening right now. And so going there is extremely difficult. And the job of therapy is to very safely find a way of making yourself feel calm, to you open yourself up, to see yourself back then, but stay firmly rooted in the here and now. And that's really the skill of a good therapist.
And that takes several different approaches, doesn't it? What are the sort of three major approaches that you use?
The oldest approach is hypnosis. And in hypnosis, you again help people to observe themselves from a distance. And that used to be the treatment until about 1990, when hypnosis sort of went out of the window around the false memory stuff, because people said, oh, in the hypnosis you get false memories. What really opened up my world was learning about EMDR, eye movement desensitization, where you ask a person to call back what they saw, heard, smelled, experienced back then, without asking them to talk about it. and then you ask them to move their eyes from side to side in front of your eyes. It was a bizarre treatment, and when people in my clinic first started to do it, I said, I'm afraid I have to fire you if you keep doing that. And then more and more people came back and said, this really helps me. And before too long, I was looking at it, and I got a grant from the National Institute of Health to study EMDR. And EMDR turned out to be a sensationally effective treatment for what we call simple trauma. As an event happens, an assault, an accident, and in a few sessions, 80% of our patients were completely well. And that for me was fascinating, because it was such a different method than anybody ever used. And so I thought, oh, if wiggling your fingers can do it, when people tell me tapping acupressure points can do it, like maybe. And then we got into yoga, and it turned out that yoga was a more effective treatment for traumatized people than any medication that I or anybody else had studied, and they studied quite a few of them. Not that it cures you, but it helps you to develop a relationship with your body. It helps you to feel calmer. We call it befriending your body. Because the issue with trauma is that all that stuff sits inside of you. So trauma is not a story about something that happened a long time ago. It continues to play itself out in the landscape of your body, as I like to say. And so if you do things like yoga, but probably Tai Chi and probably Qigong, and maybe playing chamber music, and maybe tango dancing, and maybe capoeira. Nobody's ever studied any of these things. They ought to be able to do some of that also.
And talk therapy, I mean, is that part of
talk therapy? The most important thing about talk therapy is if the trauma becomes a secret. And much of trauma is a secret. When you're being abused, being molested in a violent relationship, you feel ashamed of yourself. And so talk therapy is mainly good in order to sort out, to know what you know and to know what you feel. Like for example,
but that alone is probably not going to help somebody.
It's an important part of saying, okay, this is what happened to me. This is the reality. I wasn't just making it up. It was scary when my dad beat me. It was horrifying when my parents were beating each other up. And I was very little, so even though I felt it was my fault back then, when I put myself back being that 5-year-old kid listening to my parents fighting, I now know, and I say to that kid in my imagination, you know, it's awful that you had to go through that, because there was nothing you could do as a 5-year-old. But the 5-year-old kid then thought that it was probably my fault that my parents were fighting. And so that feeling of, I caused this violence in my family, may stay with people in some sort of imperceptible, quiet way. And so beginning to open that up and sorting that out is an important part of treatment. But you need to deal with the memories. You need to deal with the somatic imprints of the memories. And so
how that plays out in their
in your
life.
body, in your physiology. So you need to deal with the memories. And also, particularly if you have been chronically abused and neglected, the whole brain develops what we call in a use-dependent manner. And so your brain adapts itself to the environment in which you live. And so if you're surrounded by terror and lack of support, you develop a brain that is constantly in fight and flight and always looking for danger and may hit people before you hit them. That becomes your pattern, becomes your map of you and the world. And those things are to some degree treatable with psychological interventions, but my hot topic these days is neurofeedback. I started to learn this about 8 years ago, that you can play computer games with your own brainwaves. And we hook people up, and we have on the computer screen, we can see what the brainwaves look like, and you see these patterns of hyper-arousal where you shouldn't be hyper-aroused, or no activity where you should have activity. And then you play computer games with people, and you basically set the games that whenever you, let's say you have a movie, not the technique I use, but I like it a lot. You see a movie, as long as your brain makes the right brainwaves that are desirable, you see the movie. let's say a movie about penguins feeding or something. And then the moment your brain starts making movie waves that are not very helpful, the movie becomes dark.
Yeah.
And you want to see what happened to those penguins.
Right.
So your brain starts, like, what can I do? And
Yeah.
before too long, your brain finds a way to see those penguins again. And so you can encourage the brain, or as we call it, train the brain to create patterns of engagement that makes you more attentive, more quiet, more present in the current world.
Okay.
And it's a very powerful technique. Yeah.
You know, I was really, horrified basically to read about what was known or not known, I should say, about the incidence of incest when you were first starting your career in working with victims of incest. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, Judy Herman, who many people here know, played a very important role in bringing that to light. But I learned about incest initially independently from her because I was sitting for my boards in 1986 or something. And I was studying about incest, and it said, incest is very rare. It occurs in about 1 out of... Anyway, the calculation were that it happens to 47 people in
all of the United States.
And I'd seen already 43 incest victims in the basement of my old hospital.
Yeah.
And I thought, why does everybody gravitate to me?
Right.
And then the textbooks also say it's very psychoanalytic. I said it's very gratifying to have somebody have sex with you who you love, and so it rarely leads to bad things. And that was the given stuff that I was raised with.
And this was not that long ago. This is what is so horrifying to me. Yeah.
And then people like Judy Herman started to really research it, and then later on I jumped on that bandwagon. And then we saw, as people had, back in the 1880s, before Freud even, they saw that childhood sexual abuse is a very major issue in mental illness. And in splitting oneself and developing multiple personalities and very strange adaptations to the world, and how the pain, the hurt, the confusion about childhood sexual abuse is a major source of very serious problems in people's lives. But in my development...
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and this is something, you know, that people don't always remember initially. They just know they don't... They may have symptoms and they don't really know where that came from.
They reenact rather than remember. That's the old statement, first from Janet and then from Freud. They reenact, and that's their way of remembering. And that's what we see. We do a lot of sexual abuse evaluations in our clinic, and a lot of these kids, nobody knows what's going on with them, but suddenly these kids are doing sexual things. That's how did they learn to do stuff like that?
Right.
And people remember and don't remember, and you know, when you treat people with those histories, it is very painful to remember. And so there is a lot of reason that they don't want to remember. And so there's always this debate, is it repression or dissociation? Is it voluntary or not voluntary? I don't know if we can make the distinction. The mind doesn't want to go into horror. And the mind protects itself. And so people do push it out of their minds, voluntarily or involuntarily. And then it comes back, and suddenly you see a TV program or you date somebody, and suddenly you start seeing images or have sensations that go back to them.
You know, one of the other things you brought out in your book is that there really isn't a specific diagnosis for children who have suffered prolonged abuse,
it's a huge
either sexual
issue.
Or physical abuse.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. I've spent 20 years.
Yeah. Well, first of all, why is it important that there is a diagnosis?
It's very important because childhood abuse and neglect is about a lack of safety and a lack of ownership of your body, your destiny. And so you behave as if you're in danger. And the issue is about creating safety and to put the experience in perspective. If you call that oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder or dysregulated mood regulation disorder or disruptive impulse disorder, all these incredibly stupid diagnoses that are in the DSM, you totally miss the boat. And you're likely to say, oh, this kid is messed up and probably has bad genes, and let's give them some more drugs. And the poorer you are and the fewer resources you have, the more likely you are to get one of these stupid diagnoses and to be given drugs. So last year, kids in America got $18.1 billion worth of medications. And the bad thing about it is that sometimes medications are painfully necessary, but these medications affect the dopamine system in the brain, which makes for engagement in the world and motivation and energy and enthusiasm. And if you kill that in an 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old kid, they miss life. And they will probably be thrown off track. And it's unlikely that they will ever make it to become productive members of society. It's a gigantic public health issue.
So if there were, what would the diagnosis be if you were creating it? Or what have you proposed, I should say?
The diagnosis, my colleagues and I of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network proposed, it's called developmental trauma disorder. It's vague enough so you allow for a number of adaptations, but the focus of it is that bad things have happened to you without somebody protecting you against it. And then you get 3 problems. One is a problem with attention. Because you're so filled with terror and fear and helplessness, you cannot really focus on your schoolwork, you cannot engage with people, you cannot playfully engage with stuff. And of course, if you're a kid who cannot pay attention, you cannot learn. The second thing is affect regulation. The job of life, going to school, is that you need to be able to sit still and pay attention and not blow up when somebody bugs you and not fall down when somebody bugs you, and you need to be able to control your sexuality and all that sort of stuff. And there's major problems with all of that. So right now, when you have problems with impulses and you hurt and insult people, you're called, he's an insulting person. That's true. But let's find out what the underlying pathology is so you can actually do something about it. So the second thing is impulsivity. The third thing is that if you have been hurt by people, you become very distrustful of other people. And so you cannot form mutually satisfying relationships. And that's a huge issue.
Making this a diagnosis would really help change the treatment plan in a more global sense than it sounds like too. Well, I'd like to actually get more detail on this, but I have to tell you, we are out of time. This happened very fast for both of us, I think. But you have been watching Behind the Pages from the staff of 22 City View. I'm Diane Goshgarian. And I really could just sit here all afternoon talking to you about this subject because, it's so interesting and also